This week's podcast episode is a recording from an August 29th book talk I gave in conversation with Anthony Gauger-Taylor and Mayday Books. Haymarket Books recently republished Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. We'll put a link in the show notes where you can pick up a copy. I also want to give a special thanks to Biel, who did the audio recording for this episode. It turned out really great. And also a special shout out to Mayday Books and the Minnesota Anti-War Committee. We hope you enjoy this episode, and be sure to pick up a copy of the republication of Our History is the Future.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. This event was sponsored by Mayday Books. My name is Anthony. I'm a volunteer at Mayday Books. For reference to everybody here, I'm an anti-war activist. I'm also a labor organizer. I was born on the south side of Minneapolis. I grew up about 4 blocks away from here. So those things will kind of inform the questions that I asked Nick and kind of the way that I read and interpreted the book. So without any further ado, everybody please welcome Nick Estes. So Nick is an enrolled member of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. He's also a co-founder of the Red Nation and editor of Red Media. For folks that don't know, we have Nick's books for purchase and back, as well as Red Nation books. All purchases and sales tonight of those books are going to be donated to Red Media, so they're going to a great cause. At some point, Nick can probably talk to you about what Red Media is and what they do. But what we're really here to talk about tonight is the re-release of Nick's book 5 years from its original publication, Our History is the Future. So yeah, we'll just get going here. How you doing, Nick? You're back in Minneapolis.
Hamatakiapi, Nape Jusmapi Chante Washte. Thanks so much, Anthony, for this introduction. I just want to say Anthony was a student of mine. Actually, last semester, he graduated. He wrote a really excellent senior thesis on the history of the land grant institution of University of Minnesota, but its role in the colonization and the theft of Dakota lands specifically. I don't know what he plans on doing with that, but I hope he publishes it someday because it was really great.
All right, so we'll kind of start off here with the assumption that a lot of folks here probably haven't read the book, so we'll kind of give a baseline. So I think first, Nick, can you just kind of give like an overview of Our History is the Future?
Sure. So back in 2016, actually this story starts before then, and I'll just kind of jump around in the timeline. I think it was back in 2011 when I first got involved in anti-KXL, Keystone XL pipeline kind of activism and organizing. I was doing more of a support role, doing research, but nonetheless, the original pipeline crossed near our reservation territory, our boundaries, and in fact, they were trying to reroute power from the dam that flooded our land to a pump station to the that would essentially power the Keystone XL pipeline. And it was a big fight internally within our tribe. The tribal council was really for this project and had made agreements with TransCanada that we found out later. A lot of this was kept away from sort of public purview, from tribal membership. And so I worked with an organization, a grassroots organization called Wichoni Untipi, which was headed by people like Kevin Wright, his twin, Kevin Wright, and the twins, Louis Grassrope and Loretta Grassrope. And they really kind of led this grassroots campaign to stop, or at least make aware that this was happening, but then also how it affected our rights, internally within the reservation, but then also what that meant for membership. So in many ways, what happened in 2016 was already happening 5 years before. There were already camps being established according to our Teochepai system, which is a clan-based system. And in fact, Wichoni Untipi was trying to reintroduce that sort of clan-based system on our reservation, and they were working, of course, in tandem with our relatives and other Lakota reservations and Dakota reservations as well. So I think to many, Standing Rock came as a surprise, but to the people who I knew who were involved, it was just kind of the logical outcome of a lot of sort of organizing. And in fact, Kevin Wright and others had been part of an occupation back in the 90s when the governor, or when the state of South Dakota was trying to return land that had been seized by the Army Corps of Engineers along the Missouri River back to the state itself without tribal input. And that land was actually seized. It was never authorized by Congress. The Army Corps of Engineers just kind of basically went in and seized the land and took it and then assumed jurisdiction. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a legal challenge to that other than things like, occupations. And part of it has to do with the fact that the Army Corps of Engineers is this kind of amorphous entity that the federal government and state governments don't really know what to do, but nonetheless does the permitting process of pipelines, especially international pipelines, or those that cross key waterways. The Army Corps of Engineers was involved in planning and plotting the route of the Line 3 pipeline, for example. So they play this kind of role in the sort of permitting process, but it's hard to actually address any sort of legal contestations with them. And so I'm a damn historian, DAM, but also maybe DAMN. I was really curious about my own tribal history because most of our people don't live on reservation, and that has to do with the flooding of our homelands. And also, my family was personally affected by this, and I'll give you a story. It's not in this book, but back in 2011, when the Cobell lawsuit was settled by the Obama administration, it was one of the largest class action lawsuits to be settled. The Eloise Cobell, who was a Blackfeet, what was she? An accountant, did a forensic audit of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and found that it had essentially mismanaged over $170 billion in tribal assets that they could actually see on paper. To kind of give you an idea what that means, they had to literally create an entire underground archive over like 10 million pages of paper in Anadarko, Kansas, just to house the discovery items for this particular lawsuit. And the tribes got $3.5 billion out of that, which is like essentially pennies on the dollar to what they were actually owed. So as part of that process, they sent out, original allotments to families. I don't know if anyone got those in the mail, if they have tribal lands or allotted lands. But I was sitting down with my grandpa and he's like showing me these photos. My dad showed me these photos too. He got like, there's these, GIS satellite imagery of our land, and they were all blue. And I was like, guy, because I noticed they printed them off. The Department of Interior actually spent some money on us for once and printed them off in color, and I was like, wow, that's like all the maps are blue. And I was like, why is that? And I was looking closer and closer. And then I realized that all of our land was in the middle of the river. And it was like, but they still mapped it out. Somebody like at the Department of Interior literally went out and like mapped out our land that is literally submerged. So it affected our family, personally. And in fact, my grandfather, who I was interviewing and meeting with at that time, wrote a book called Make Way for the Bruleys, which was the first history of our tribe. And that was back in 1963. And then another grandfather of mine, George Estes, wrote a book called Kuichasho Yate, which was published in 1972. My other grandfather, I have a lot of grandfathers, but another grandfather of mine wrote the introduction to that. And I never knew these things as a child. And so I found these books, in my grandfather's papers and my dad's papers. And I was like, wow, my grandpa's wrote books, who would have thought? And because we weren't really, I never read a book by a Native person until I was in college. So in many ways, this book is an extension of that. And so I show up at Standing Rock, and I'm just like nerd kid, like who knows all the history about the dams. And I realized while I was there, a lot of the elders understood, the history really, really well, and the treaty law and how it pertained to the sort of legal arguments, according to federal law, but also to indigenous customary law, why this was a violation of their sovereignty. And they knew it pretty well. But I guess like I was this, it was like that moment in time where it's like you train to do one thing, and you don't know when that's gonna like be relevant until this major once in a lifetime protest movement and encampment, spiritual movement happens. So I kind of just fell into that, and I abandoned a dissertation that I was writing at the time. I was in grad school, and I just wrote this book because I had all the research material, and it was relevant. And so in many ways, it was just an extension of what people had already been doing. I don't think it's actually unique, and I don't want it to be the only, and I never intended it to be the only book about Standing Rock or this particular issue. And I think the other part of it was that you had a lot of non-native press and media and writers coming in who were telling the story and kind of creating this spectacular event. And it was very much like it is today. Trump is running for president. You have an incumbent sort of Democrat, but you have all these kind of unresolved issues, right? And in not just federal Indian sort of policy in our relationship with the government and this pipeline, but also these social issues. And so this movement kind of came out of that. You had, after November 8th, things changed as well after Election Day. But I think there are a lot of parallels and lessons, and I feel like just the last two presidential cycles alone, it should have taught us a lot about a lot of things. But I feel like we're kind of falling back into, not us personally, but I think society as a whole is falling back into this kind of repetitive pattern to think that, and I can get into this later, to think that like the election of a president can help really resolve some of these really fundamental issues with Native people. And I'll give you an example, and then I'll shut up. But back in 2014, Obama visited the Standing Rock Reservation. He was like one of 6 sitting presidents to visit a reservation during his time period. And a lot of us remember it was like the Flag Day powwow, it was a Veterans Day powwow. And he went there and he said, he made these promises specifically to the youth. And a lot of Native people took that to heart, especially the young people. So when this pipeline issue came about in early 2016, it was like Standing Rock youth that were the ones that really were the spark, that later became the flame. They ran, cross country relay runs to Washington D.C. They tried to meet with Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton wouldn't meet with them. They tried to meet with Democratic officials, and they wouldn't meet with them. So it was, it was kind of like a repeat in some ways of what we're experiencing now with the question of Palestine. And I think there's just a lot to sort of reflect on. And I haven't really resolved a lot of those sort of things that have happened at that time. And in fact, many of the cases, the federal cases against water protectors are still playing out in federal courts. And they're still kind of trying to do these sort of dragnets of, doing civil suits to subpoena people. I was subpoenaed for a federal case. I can talk about that if anybody wants to know what it's like to get a federal subpoena to testify and to basically try to find anyone who's written about Standing Rock and get them to testify and out people for alleged criminal activities, because some of these activities that they're looking at have no statute of limitations because of the laws that they've created that can be retroactively applied to this particular situation. And the point is to have a chilling effect, right? And this is happening under a Republican presidency administration, their DOJ. It's happening under a Democratic administration and their DOJ. So there's lessons to sort of draw out with that. And I hope this book kind of, I don't really get into those legal matters, but I hope this book sort of provides a historical context of looking at Standing Rock as a moment within a larger movement of history, as well as a movement within sort of a moment of in time of history, not to forget about it, because I think the memory of it has. Is that my niece and mean? Hey, baby, very cute. Um, anyways, I'll let you move on to the next question.
All right. So I think you kind of touch on a lot of things that I'd like to get to. But so thinking about this book, I think provides a lot of context for everything that has come before, right? You get into federal Indian policy and you talk about the Marshall Trilogy, and you build it to all these moments, right? You talk about the Fort Laramie Treaty and how this affects Keystone XL and the water protector movement and all these things. So I was wondering if you could give a little bit of context to two things to give an overview for everybody about everything that we're going to be talking about. And one of those things is the origins chapter, which is chapter 2, where you talk about a lot of these things. So you open that chapter by discussing land as the essential feature of indigenous resistance and, more importantly, refusal to U.S. rule. For me, and I think a lot of people, the question of settler colonialism is a question that I think needs to be answered, but also I'm kind of sick of answering it, because I think it's a word that a lot of people use and don't really understand, for better or worse. But I think you lay it out really well here. So could you elaborate on this idea of land and resistance, right? Because I've heard you say, right, land is always the answer, right, when we're talking about indigeneity and indigenous nationhood. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's several, when you start talking about land, and you even in this origins chapter, when you talk about creation stories, when a lot of non-native people listen to that, there's this effect. I call it the magical flute music effect, where it's they kind of just hear this kind of the flute music's playing. And it's no, these are actual material connections. You can't live without the land. You can't live without the water. And I would say that Native people aren't unique in human society, in the sense that all cultures develop these kind of relationships out of their, the material relationships with land, plants, and animals. It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from. There is always a relationship there. But in this context, the ability to reproduce oneself, on the land, both biologically, socially, culturally, linguistically, meant that you had to establish a relationship. And Native cultures, the Ocheti Shakoni, where I'm, the nation that I come from, is not perfect in history, and nobody ever said it was. But I think there's a tendency to kind of have the myth of the noble kind of Indian at one with nature. Everyone's seen the film Avatar. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they've seen the new one, Water Warriors, or whatever it's called. But our culture developed from that relationship, and so did our language structure. And so it was a non-capitalist, it was a striving towards non-capitalist and non-coercive relations. It's not to say that there wasn't oppression, that there wasn't strife, that there wasn't war, that there wasn't imbalance, and there's plenty of that. And even if you look in our oral traditions, we weren't always the greatest relatives to our animal or plant nations, but we were always striving to be and live in correct relations. So that's why a lot of, if you even look back at a lot of the early Christian colonizers, they had a hard time translating things like sale, the word sale. There was a word in our language to alienate property, because property just didn't exist, the concept as we know in law. So all those things had to, it wasn't just the physical colonization of the land, it was also the colonization of our minds, in the sense of distorting that language and introducing a whole new system of an ideology. So our economic system was based on, it was a non-capitalist. I wouldn't say it's anti-capitalist or socialist or communist or whatever. I would just say it was non-capitalist. And it wasn't trending towards capitalism either. So it proves that capitalism is completely artificial and human-made construct in that sense. And it doesn't mean that Native people can't become capitalists. Of course they can. But this chapter is to just show the kind of deep historical ties to this place and why, people on the river would develop these kinds of relationships and why they would, defend them in the way that they do. And settler colonialism, I agree with you. It's a term that's, I would say, overused and often, misunderstood. To the point where, like, the Atlantic has now become, I don't know if anyone reads the Atlantic magazine. Maybe I just like outed myself as like a bougie, whatever, a purveyor of, coastal elitism, but they are now on this kick of, like, saying that anyone who uses settler colonialism to describe things happening outside the United States is an anti-Semite, because they don't want to address what's happening in Palestine, when in fact Zionists call themselves settlers and they believe in a colonial project, and that's the way that, the early American European project saw itself. It didn't see it like, when immigrants come to a country, they assimilate to the sort of dominant society, its legal structures, right? Europeans, when they came here, didn't assimilate to native legal structures or languages. That's why we're speaking English, right? And that's like a basic thing to say. So what had to be eliminated was not only this relationship to the land, but also this kind of larger superstructure of culture. And that was the point of boarding schools. That was a point of introducing, things like the fur trade, to essentially not overturn our social relations with, animals. Now we are, harvesting them for profit, but also it was subverting the role of, like, Native women in society, because now Native women in that economic system of extraction were now subservient to men, where in the past that wasn't always the case. So you see this radical transformation. So settler colonialism is about the land, but there's all these other components that are happening. Like, Europeans didn't come here because they hated our language or culture or spirituality or the way we dress. They came here for the land. That's what settler colonialism is, pure and simple. But it's also more complex, and the analytical frame of settler colonialism doesn't actually provide an alternative. And so I think it's also a little bit limited the way it's been articulated in North America, because if you think about successful anti-colonial or decolonial revolutions that have happened in other places, that have destroyed, overturned, thwarted, stopped, whatever, reverse settler colonialism, they've been incredibly violent. Like, the Algerian Revolution was incredibly violent. 1 million Algerians died during that process. The South African anti-apartheid struggle was incredibly violent. Today we talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and hearkening back to the anti-apartheid struggle, which is important. That was a nonviolent form of advocacy and protest. But there were armed groups. Like, the reason why Nelson Mandela was held in prison is because he refused to renounce violence as a means for liberation. That gets distorted. Like, lots of people died. The entire region of South Africa, not just the country, was thrown into, decades of war because of that. Israel armed the white African, white supremacist government with a nuclear weapon to say how, you will not overturn this government or we'll nuke you. That was the kind of genocidal intent that they had, not outside of the context of Palestine. So we have to think about this in terms of, not just this kind of passive process. It's incredibly violent. And I tell my students this a lot, and we can't even comprehend. And I'll give you a figure, and you can look it up. So the Government Accountability Office came out with a report back in 2021. I believe it was 2021. Could be 2022. It was around that time. And they found that there were 150,000 individual ancestors, native ancestors, that were still in the possession of federally funded institutions. 150,000 individual, just single, not like a bone, not like a hand, not a part of a person, but the entire person, like a person, individual. 150,000. That was 5% of the original collection that these federal institutions had after years, centuries, literally centuries of grave robbing. I don't know if anyone's good at math, but what is 100% of that number? You know, I think you multiply it by 20, whatever that gets you. It's millions. And that doesn't even account for the private collections, because the federal law as it exists doesn't extend to those. So we can't even comprehend, we don't even have the language, we don't even, you know, in mainstream society, we don't even have the numbers to talk about the level of human destruction that was required to build the United States, you know? And we're still dealing with that today, like through what is called historical trauma, or it's not really historical, it's present trauma, you know? And so I think about that in terms of this question of settler colonialism. And I hope I documented in this book where it's like, it's showing this is a process that's unfolding, not in like a split second, but over decades, centuries. And I would also like to add that it's not inevitable. And the conclusion, you know, of genocidal elimination, you know, is not inevitable, and it can't be the final answer to this question. There has to be, you know, an alternative.
Great, thank you. Initially I wanted to ask you about the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, because I think it sets up all of this really well. But I just think I want to get to something else. So your first chapter, Siege, there's a character that shows up in this chapter a lot. And it's the era of Barack Obama, right? And I think about like the moment that we're in right now, right? Understandably, there is concern of like a Trump presidency, right? But right now what we're seeing is, it's got to be Kamala, right? Because what if this alternative? But everything that you're writing about, that moment is during the Obama presidency, right? And like, I think I was fresh out of high school when Obama ran for president, and that was the era of change. It was supposed to be this progressive new path forward, but progressive for who, I think, is the question. So I think about, my question to you is this a similar moment with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, who we can get to later? But like, what does a Kamala Harris president mean for water protectors? What does it mean for the land?
I try not to operate in like predictions, because you don't even want to hear what I have to say about who I think is going to win. But you don't want to hear it. It's not, because no, you're going to walk away being pessimistic. But I'll say this, and I think it's important. I saw this at this time, and it was intensified because you're at the camps and you're doing. I was outside of the camps and doing a lot of solidarity work and going to marches, and it seemed like things were going to change. It really did. Like, you could go anywhere, and like for the first time that in my small existence on this planet, you could go to a place, a major metropole, and like talk about Native people, and people knew. They could point to Standing Rock as like, yeah, like I saw that on television, and it felt like there was a change, going to come. Was that the Sam Cooke song that I just like subconsciously cited just now? That was actually the campaign song for Barack Obama. It's a good song, by the way, and I'm still hoping that change will come. But it was a moment of like, what I was trying to document it objectively, because the Standing Rock has an interesting connection to the White House in that time period, because he had visited. So there's no way that Barack Obama didn't know that this was happening. And there was this sense that, he helped kind of stop Keystone XL, which is not entirely true, by the way. He only stopped a quarter of Keystone XL, the quarter of Keystone XL that went through our territory. So his argument was, well, crosses international boundary. I'm interested in domestic oil production and infrastructure. So that's coming from Alberta. We can cancel it. The rest of it, we're going to let go, through Oklahoma and other states, and it was still protested. So he can't even be congratulated for that. It's not even it's a 3/4 defeat, or 3/4 failure in some ways, or 3/4 concession. On top of that, he helped boost domestic oil production. He helped target specifically, and I look at this in the final chapter. I didn't include this. I don't know why I didn't include it. I don't know what was going through my mind at the time, but I didn't include this at the time. But he created a series of sanctions and targeting of an oil producing state known as Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves in the world. And part of that, there was an increasing fracking in the United States. So domestic oil supply really production increased in the US, and it also dropped the price of oil. These sanctions, as well as the price of oil, really kind of threw Venezuela into turmoil. And so one could argue that the construction of domestic pipelines, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, like people were arguing this on the front lines in Standing Rock. They were saying, this is Obama's foreign policy to sanction Venezuela. Because you can't, oil, like we think of finance capital and all these things, but at the end of the day, you still have to put oil in your car. You still have to, oil still fuels this economy. You can't just get rid of it. And so people were looking at this, like, to use an academic term, this critical dialectic between US foreign policy to crush Venezuela for whatever reason they want to name, ideological reasons. Oh, it's a leftist government. He's the first Black and indigenous, president. He's, coming to the United States. He's giving out handouts to Native people. He gave our tribe, Hugo Chavez gave our tribe, funding and resources for heating oil in the winter, because heating oil prices in our reservations are some of the highest in the region. But people were saying this on the front lines. They were saying, this Dakota Access Pipeline is not only targeting Native people, it's also targeting Venezuela and the Bolivarian Project. But you couldn't, I don't want to name names, but you couldn't say that to the green NGOs. Because they're not, how are they going to sell that to their donors? But Native people understood it. They're not, just in the same way that Native people aren't stupid around the question of electric vehicles. Those things don't just fall from the sky. Lithium batteries don't just fall from the sky. They have to come from somewhere. They come from places like, the Andes, where you have recalcitrant, quote unquote, recalcitrant governments led by indigenous socialists, like in Bolivia, or you have to go to places like the Northern Iron Range to get nickel for this new EV transition. So we understand that this is still an extractive economy. Native people aren't dumb, and I think this moment in time, it shows you that, like, however bad Trump is in your mind, and he's bad, when he was saying, unleash American energy, he was really just building off the Obama era energy policies and the US foreign policy towards Venezuela, amongst a whole host of other countries. So I think that's important to put into context, and it scares me, on a personal note, it scares me when I watch a Democratic candidate who's supposed to be, who a lot of people at the DNC convention, there was a lot of Native representation. They read a land acknowledgement and professed a commitment to indigenous people while not letting an indigenous Palestinian person speak, but that's a whole nother story. But Kamala Harris saying that she wants to make the United States military the most lethal military in the world again, but not talking about these larger questions that I'm talking about. It was baffling to me, because life expectancy for Native people since the COVID pandemic, and during and prior to, we're now reading a lot of epidemiological studies on this that are saying that life expectancy for Native people has dropped, and it began dropping before COVID-19. They tried to kind of push it off on COVID-19 to the point I think it's like 5.9 years across the board. But in a place like South Dakota, where I was born, it was 5.9 years that it dropped. That's from being lower than the life expectancy of the average, quote unquote, average American, whatever that means. But then in a place like South Dakota, where I'm from, the median age of a Native person is 57 years old for like death. Like, that's wild to me. And that it's gotten worse than the last 2 decades. So when we ask ourselves to measure progress, whether it's a Democratic president, we have all these really, great, with reservations, caveats, nuances, representation of Native people in our political class. But how is that translated to an actual increase in well-being for Native people in general? And it scares me that was not, you can advocate for the most lethal military in the world, but you're not talking about things that like not just Native people need, but housing, education, healthcare. 1 million people died, and there's not even a conversation around healthcare. That's scary to me. 1 million people died in a pandemic. But the biggest threat is these other countries that have not killed nearly 1 million people. I would say the United States healthcare system killed 1 million people. So it's scary to me. I think we're living in a really dangerous time when, we saw this happen in 2016 and 2020, this kind of really powerful grassroots upsurge, uprising or whatever. And then it gets channeled into sort of, the duopoly or ruling class, parties, and it gets completely absorbed. And some people say co-opted. I don't know if it's entirely been co-opted, because I think these conversations still happen at a community level. They just don't translate up because it doesn't make for good politics, and it doesn't make for good sound bites. And it doesn't make for good sort of like scare tactics and scaremongering that, Trump is going to win. So I think what I tried to do in this book is to think beyond sort of presidential cycles, and to think about long-term sort of solutions, because there have been long-term alternatives that have been proposed by the movements that I'm highlighting in this book. Some of them have come to fruition. Some of them are still, being struggled over. But I think it makes us reflect a little bit more on history. I'm a historian. I walked into the future facing backwards. It's kind of a scary prospect, but that's how I view time, and that's what I was trying to do in this particular book. That's why it's called Our History is the Future. Wah, wah.
Yeah, I think this moment's really interesting because, since Kamala Harris has become the nominee, it seems like the Democratic Party is like trying to psyop us into forgetting that, international solidarity is what is most important, or that, like you talk about at Standing Rock, these solidarity networks that existed, right? Like the people that showed up, and it's not exclusive to Standing Rock, right? But, you talk about, Black Lives Matter, you talk about Two-Spirit Nation and all of these groups that show up, right, in solidarity. But I find it really fascinating that we're in this moment again with Kamala Harris, and we're being told that worry about your own issue first. These people haven't showed up for you, so you shouldn't be supporting them, right? Consider yourself. And it feels like a really dangerous moment, where we're at right now, and the way that we're meant to think about these things feels off. But so I wanted to ask you about something from your time at Standing Rock, because you don't talk about it a lot, but it's something as like a labor activist. I don't think it's talked about enough in the labor movement. And you talk about this idea of, like what a scab is in the labor movement, right? If, like workers take a strike vote, right? Like you don't cross the picket line, right? If the workers at the grocery store take a strike, you don't go into that grocery store and shop. If you're a worker, you don't go and, scab on the job and go and work while these workers are refusing to work, right? And you bring up this moment with like pipeline workers, which I think is like the correct way to think about it, but I don't think it's the way that the labor movement thinks about it, right? So I was hoping that like you could elaborate on that a little bit, right? Because you talk about, the movement and the resistance was so clear with the water protector movement and these solidarity networks resisting. But then we have these workers that, they'll say, I'm just going to do my job, right? Like I'm just doing my job, right? So what's wrong with that? Can you talk a little bit about, like this idea of like labor solidarity?
Yeah, that was kind of like a minor point in the book, but I think and it also gets to something that I wish I had done in the book. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but to bring out this point and then to think about of Minnesota, I'll talk a little bit about line 3, because that's something that's always getting positioned as like jobs, as if like Native people don't have jobs. We don't work, we're not unions or whatever it is, or what land defense isn't work or something like that. And it is, and it's I think what in this context I was thinking a lot about how the Standing Rock tribe itself, call for blockading these work sites, and people showed up, and they were defending their community, they were defending their water, right, as they should, and it was a picket. And I don't know if anyone has ever been in a union. What do you not do? You never cross a picket, right? But there was not that. These are unionized pipeline workers, by the way. Most of them are, and this is why you get a lot of unions, major unions in the United States, who support these pipelines. They position, well, you're trying to take away our jobs, and it's like, but everyone else just doesn't work except for pipeline workers. As if it's like, what's the point of a job if you can't even drink water? Or full force of the state has descended on your community to make sure that this pipeline goes through. It's disrupting your entire life. You can't go to, it was like effectively implementing an economic siege on Standing Rock, where people couldn't go to Bismarck, where a lot of people worked, because the highways were closed down. There was all these, there was National Guard checkpoints. It was, in a different context, if the United States or the world recognized the real sovereignty of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, that would be considered an act of war. That's what the United States is doing to Cuba right now. It's an effective blockade, right? And we can understand, like, every year the UN, votes against this blockade, condemns it. But that was what was effectively happening, disrupting the economic livelihoods of these people. But nobody was framing it as, it's affecting their jobs, it's taking away their jobs, because their jobs don't matter, right? And I'll switch kind of to a more relevant topic to this place, and I didn't write about this in the book, and you only can write so much, right? Also, I was a weird space when I was writing the afterword, and I had a lot of thoughts and feelings about line 3, because I was there several times, and I met with a water protector from White Earth, and she took me out to her family's ricing paddies. I think it was just called Rice Lake. There's so many lakes. I get them all. I don't know the names. I'm not from here. By the way, it was the first time I was ever refused service in a restaurant. It was at line 3. And I was like, is this a racism that's happening right now? But we went to a place called Bagley, Minnesota. I don't know if anyone knows where Bagley, Minnesota is. We were just going from one place to the next, and we were just like, we had a bunch of Navajos with me. They didn't know, I didn't know. I'm from South Dakota. I've only been to like Minnesota at that point like 3 times in my life. They were like, oh, this is our local guide, he knows. And it's like, no, dude, I don't know anything. Like, I'm not from here. They were driving around, and it's like, let's meet up halfway. And I was like, oh, Bagley looks like a great town. And we walk into this place, and I called ahead too. I was like, yeah, we're gonna have 14 people. And they're like, oh, awesome, yeah, we got your table. And we walk in, and we were with some Palestinian relatives, and they come out and they're like, Nick, oh, you don't want to go in there, man. You don't want to go in there. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, they're not seating us. And I was like, oh, like, let me see. And sure enough, they're like, you can sit down. They conceded, you can sit in the restaurant, but we're not going to feed you. We're not going to serve you. And I was like, really? I wasn't even offended. I was just like, really? Like, I was like, why? And there's reasons why. But so we went to a different town and we got food. But I was just in the middle of that the context of that, and I was with this water protector, this rice paddy, and at that summer, I think it was 2021, it was a historic drought. I don't know if anyone remembers. I mean, there's another drought coming, And all the corn crops up there turned into pineapples. I don't know if anyone knows what that looks like. There was massive wildfires in Canada. Smoke was blowing down. People were like choking. I remember waking up and just having the worst cough in my life. I was living in a tent. I hate camping, by the way. I really do. And I remember going to I think it was the Red Lake River at one of the camps at Red Lake Camp, and just seeing all these clams lined up. And I had no idea that there was freshwater clams, and they can live to be 50 to 100 years old. And the temperatures got so hot that the water started to deoxygenate, I think is the word, and they just died. And I had no idea I thought they were just like, it was like finding a seashell. And there's people who are like crying. They're like, yeah, this is really sad, man. Like the river's dying. There's, you're waking up and like there's this like red sun every morning, red sun at night. There's cops everywhere. People are like coming into camp and blaring their horns in the middle of the night. And I'm sitting with this water protector from White Earth at this ricing paddy, and she's like pointing, and I have the photos of it. She's pointing at this like water depth measure, and it's like it's just sticking out of the ground. And I was like, why is this here? And she's like, well, this is normally it's like right here. This is actually underwater. And I was like, where's the wild rice? She said, it's up there. And and she's like, this is, and she had a Ziploc baggie, and she's like, it was like literally not even a handful. It was just barely could fill her palm. She's like, this is what we harvested after a day in my family. She said, we get 80 pounds of wild rice in a single day. Like that's the normal kind of harvest that we get. Climate change is literally impacting our livelihoods because that's their job, their seasonal job that they get income from every year. It's not even calculating the impact that the pipeline caused for disrupting or potentially could disrupt those harvests. And I remember driving and listening to the radio, and they were talking about the jobs thing, right? The jobs. But nobody cared about the ricers' jobs. Then the pipeline was actually like literally a mile and a half down the road. And that image sticks with me a lot because it's like we haven't, the drought, the heat that we were experiencing, the cumulative effects of the wildfires that were coming down from Canada, that was from carbon emissions before Joe Biden was born. Think about that. That is what they were dealing with from carbon emissions from, almost 80 plus years ago. So what are those effects going to be, from this moment in time? That it was just like, that's why I say you're not going to walk away from this talk being very optimistic, but it was something that stuck in my mind, that these ricers were at the front line, and that's why they were setting up these blockades to protect these waterways, not only in defense of their economic livelihoods, which they could have framed that way, but also in defense of these non-human relations that are essential for everyone, not just Native people.
So I think now maybe is a good time. I know you wanted to read a passage from your book, so I think now is a good time for that.
Okay. I think we're like 45 minutes into this. I'll just read this passage from. It relates to Minnesota in a lot of ways. In the aftermath of the October 27, 2016 raid on the 1851 treaty camp blockading the Dakota Access Pipeline, a rancid smell permeated the camps. Police and private security had heaped the camp's remnants, ceremonial items such as eagle feathers, pipes, medicine bundles, and staffs, along with mangled tents, sleeping bags, clothing, and teepees, into a large pile near the entrance of Ocheti-Shawkoni camp. Cops and private security had urinated on the items before returning them. One night, after it was decided to ceremonially burn the urine-soaked remnants, an Ihanktua elder gathered young water protectors around a fire. She was dressed in the regalia she wore the day of the raid, hundreds of copper pennies hung by red ribbons from her dark blue trade cloth dress. She told of her ancestors who were killed during the 1862 US Dakota War. Evicted from their homelands, they fled to present-day Standing Rock, crossing the Missouri River not far from the location of the Ochetishau-Coe camp. After US military cavalrymen massacred Dakotas and Lakotas in the Whitestone Hill Buffalo Hunt camp. This was, to the day, exactly 150 years before DAPL, private security, unleashed attack dogs on unarmed water protectors at a nearby pipeline construction site. The day after Christmas in 1862, soldiers gathered up 38 Dakota men and boys at Mankato, Minnesota. Their medicine bundles were confiscated, heaped in a large pile, and burned as they were led to the gallows, singing their death songs. Their crimes? Defending their nation and homelands. The same week that President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved Black people, he also signed the death sentences of 38 Dakota patriots. The copper pennies hanging from the elders' regalia had holes drilled into Lincoln's ears with red ribbon threaded through. He didn't listen, she said of the great emancipator, so we opened his ears. After the 1876 Battle of Greasy Grass, Lakota women used awls to carve holes in Custer's ears so he would hear better in the afterlife. Now it was President Obama, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple, the Morton County Sheriff Kyle Kirchmeier, who refused to listen. As singers began a prayer song, the elder reminded the younger ones that the tears flowing from their eyes were their, quote, ancestors speaking through them, and that they were not tears of trauma, but of liberation. We survived genocide after genocide. Then she danced, and the penny swayed with the flickering fire and billowing smoke. Behind her, armed police were perched on a hill half a mile away, and their bright floodlights glared down on us. Our history is the future.
Thank you. You know, when I read, that passage, when I had reread it, like last week, I really thought about, U.S. imperialism, and you talk about how settler colonialism and U.S. imperialism are connected and they're linked, and how frequently we see this exact type of violence, right? Like all that this system knows is violence. And I think about the times that I've seen this happen, right? Just right here in Minneapolis. Like, I mean, we see it every single time that Camp Natakasi gets raided and destroyed. We see the MPD come in and they throw people's belongings and they throw their tents in the back of a truck and they toss it and they throw it, right? And then we have to ask for more stuff again, right? We saw it at the 4th Precinct, 10 years ago when Jamar Clark was murdered and people set up an occupation outside of the precinct there, and the police came in and raided the tents in the same violent fashion. We saw it on the University of Minnesota campus during the Palestine Solidarity encampments just this past May when, these kids who are, they're in school full time, they're probably working 20, 30, 40 hours a week. Like these are kids that have virtually no time on their hands and they're choosing to spend it occupying to try and get this university that they're attending to divest. And then we see the same type of violence towards these students. And we saw it again, I think, at a university in Michigan. Students were just arrested just last week. And so I think about that and how it relates to the moment now. And I do want to talk about Minneapolis and the now part of this book. But there is something that I want to ask that kind of segues to that. You have a chapter dedicated to the Red Power movement, right? Like this is Minneapolis. I think everybody here is probably well acquainted with, the American Indian movement, and it's starting here. But you preface it with the policy of relocation, which I think is really important because it's fascinating to me that the policy of relocation, of forced relocation, comes out of the United States federal government trying to break down the kinship that Native people have, right? And it backfired, right? Because all of these different people from different nations found each other, and they found a resistance in a new type of way, right? I think, you say in the book that, the majority of Native people don't live on reservations. They live in urban cores. Most Native folks here in South Minneapolis are probably here for some facet of that reason. Like I think about myself. My grandpa's from the LCO reservation. My grandma is from the Menominee reservation. And, she moved to Chicago in the 50s because her tribe was terminated, right? Like she had no choice. She was forced out. And then, a few years later moves to South Minneapolis. And, here's my dad and, my aunties and uncles, and I'm here now. But so can you kind of like segue, the Red Power movement and what all of this does to, in that movement, right? Like they are the ancestors of the future, right? They're the ancestors of now that has built us to this moment of water protectors and land defenders at the Red Roof Depot and all of these different things.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I think I'll just say that that phrase that I used in the afterword of this book, Ancestors of the Future, actually comes from an interview that was done with Madonna Thunderhawk. You should read it. She's basically saying, like, she was asked by a friend of mine, former student of mine, Jen Marley, about why she would sacrifice her life, which actually caused a lot of turmoil in her family life, and she faced repression. Why she would give her life over to the movement. She was part of every major occupation and event of the American Indian movement in the Red Power era. And she, like, without hesitation, she just said, so that I could be a good ancestor to future generations. That somebody would look back and say, like, that I struggled. And that just kind of like for me clicked in my mind. Vijay Prashad, he's a writer. He calls these things detonator sentences that kind of, they're just like phrases that sometimes they can be like slogans, but it's something that just encapsulates something that's much deeper than just like 6 or 7 words. And that's, like, to me, the title of the afterword, and really kind of speaks to what exactly you were saying, Anthony, that it's like these, she may not realize in her lifetime the fruits of the things she struggled for, right? And I look at it from that activist sense, but then also, a kind of contemporary of hers, who was a scholar, is a Dakota activist or Dakota writer named Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who recently passed away, who also said something very similar, coming at it from a different sort of lens, an intellectual lens, where she's like, she's talking about this elder who was speaking to her, and she's like, you don't even own your own life here to ensure the coming of, future generations. And that isn't something that I feel is like a value, like a universal value in this culture. We think of our relations as the ones that exist in the present, but not temporally in time, from the back and then the future, or from the past and the future. And I just thought that was a really unique way of thinking about it. And it shows something like the American Indian movement wasn't like a typical protest movement of its time period. And in many ways, it's kind of bizarre because it happened, really blew up as the anti-war movement was waning. It never was, it never formally collapsed like the Black Panther Party and other like Chicano movements. It continues to this day. Some my friends and relatives are here who are the product of that. And continue on that thing. And it's also has become, taken up in a way by young people, that I think it shows that it's still alive. And and for me, I didn't grow up in a city. I was born in a really rural part of South Dakota. So the city thing for me is different. I included that piece in there because it is important to remember that it's like, to be a land defender, to be a water protector, it doesn't mean that you're like in Minnesota and Bagley, fighting a pipeline, or in like Ball, on the Standing Rock Reservation, but it's actually here. And I learned that from, my friends, Rachel, Vinny, Crow, Joe, Sophie, who are all here, and I saw that in Albuquerque with a lot of my friends and relatives who are there as well, and the vibrancy of indigenous movements and yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
I know that you say that you're not a poet, but you did write a poem, and it is in this book, and I believe you wrote it after visiting Palestine, correct?
Yeah.
Would you like to read it for everybody?
Sure. I'll read it and I'll just talk a little bit about it. In Palestine, I learned that poetry measures distance. Bint Nakba, and don't you forget it, my grandfather warned me. Jehan Diseso read from her poem commemorating the Nakba's 70th anniversary in an East Jerusalem basement theater. We were told the Gazan writers were not allowed to leave the world's largest open-air prison camp to participate in this year's Palestine Festival of Literature. How far was Gaza, I wondered. Our indigenous territories seem large and vast, but Palestine seems so small on the map in comparison. The distance to Gaza is measured by security checkpoints, I was told, which can take hours or days to cross if one is lucky. And for millions, the right of return to one's homelands is measured by concrete walls, concertina wire, citizenship status, stamps on a passport, Arabic names, UN resolutions, the Israeli nation-state law, and families of settlers occupying Palestinian homes and villages. In Ramallah, Omar Barghouti, the founder of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, told us he was on his way to the United States to attend his daughter's wedding and to speak about the right to peacefully boycott one's occupier. I told him to meet with American Indian leaders when he arrived, and that he's always welcome in our Lakota homelands as a relative and a friend. Those words were useless, however, because days later, our occupier denied him access to our home. From Palestine, the distance to Turtle Island is measured by visas and walls, settler laws, and State Department directives. The Great March of Return was also a measure of distance. How far was one willing to travel for freedom? At what cost? Palestinian historian Salman Abu Sita reminds us that many of the hundreds of villages emptied after the Nakba in southern Palestine are walkable from Gaza. In other words, the right of return for hundreds of thousands is within walking distance. During the Great March of Return, Israeli snipers targeted the backs of knees to force amputation as Gazans attempted to cross the perimeter fence. Jehan's poem sticks in my mind, and if we lose our legs, we will crawl on our hands and elbows. Despite the distances we must travel for freedom, Palestine is always near my heart. Colonial time creates different temporalities, speeds up and slows down. It's thick like mud, weighing on the feet of the colonized, attempting to stick them in place in the past or in forever negation. The feet of the colonizer, on the other hand, are light and mobile. The colonizer's time is quick. A US passport, the right color skin, the correct language, anything but Arabic. And an entitled jaunt grant fast access to a world others only dream about. A sidewalk, an access road. Air, an ocean. Yet, the colonial reality is meant to exaggerate time, to make its novelty on the historical stage seem as natural as the olive groves and rolling hills. Like the ocean or Gaza, the history of known freedom is just over that hill. Though it stretches far back into time, it is familiar to everyone. A poem, a song, a story, a stone. You can smell it. It's the fires that still burn in our hearts, thousands of grasslands and sacred mountains away, where we also put our feet in the dirt, grasped our history and said no, and we came crashing down on them like waves of history. And I wrote this after I woke up one morning in Ramallah, and I could smell the sea, and I was like, really kind of taken. It was like a kind of a weird experience because most Palestinian, the sea is so close, but you can't access it from Ramallah. And I just thought that was so bar. You can literally smell the ocean, but you can't go to it. And that's kind of what and also Palestinians just have beautiful poetry. It's like Arabic, I don't speak it, but from what I understand is a very like poetic and romantic language. And I feel like even like Lakota in some ways, there's some similarities. Like there's no direct translation into English. And I feel like our when I look at and I hear orators who are, first language Lakota speakers, from what I can understand, their language is very beautiful as well. And so I thought there was a little symmetry or a similarity there. And in fact, Lydia Warren Soldier was once, asked an elder, she was like, I think it was Albert Whitehat, she was like, did Lakotas ever write poetry? And she said, yeah, he said, yeah, we have songs, that's our poetry. And it's true, if you ever listen to our songs are really beautiful, if you know what they're saying. But that's my really bad attempt to write poetry.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a segue into, like the here and now. So I think like reading and listening to that poem, think a lot about how what is happening in Palestine and the way in which Palestinian people have to live under occupation and apartheid is something that, like right now as we sit in this room, seems almost unfathomable, right? And I think you illustrate that really well. But I think about something that you write about in your afterword briefly, which is the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, which, we're in South Minneapolis, right? I assume most people here are, they're not new to this community. They understand what happened. I'm sure a lot of you were here in 2020. And I think about, the few days that we had where everything was different in the city of Minneapolis, right? And those things that seemed unfathomable, were real for a few days. And something hit me when you were talking about the smell. I remember, so I grew up like 3 blocks away from the 3rd precinct. My grandparents, their house was literally 2 blocks away. My other grandma's in an apartment a block down. So like as the precinct is on fire, they're like in the back of my mind is like fire gonna catch, or is ash gonna fall and hit the apartment or the house, whatever. But I remember I went to check on my grandpa, I think like maybe the first night after the fires, and like anybody who's here knows, like you went outside and like you could smell the tear gas everywhere, right? Like it hit your eyes the next morning. And I remember I went to check on my grandpa and he was outside gardening. But, where I'm getting to is we had a governor at that time that called in the National Guard in this really heavily militarized way. And I think for a short period of time, we got an ounce of the experience that other countries get, right, when the U.S. military occupies, right? Because everybody here knows, right, there were armored vehicles all up and down Lake Street. I was like just trying to get to work, and they're everywhere, right? Like we got armed men and women everywhere, and helicopters overhead, everything, right? And and so I think about that. And I know, you had talked about that you would wish that you had written about line 3 a little bit. And Tim Walz, plays a role in all of this too. I guess like what I'm asking is, like what have you learned from your time in Minneapolis, right? Like what experiences have you seen that, that reflect, right? Either whether it's Standing Rock or your experiences in Palestine.
I love Minneapolis. One thing that was different, maybe it's just because I know the culture a little bit more, is that like the Native community here was really welcoming and like really plugged into a lot of things. And there's a strong community here. Like having lived in South Dakota and elsewhere in different urban centers, I'd say the Minneapolis Native community is probably the most organized in some ways. So like that's something to be really proud about. And it's not just the Native community. There's other like I was really surprised by a lot of the kind of like, you're actually neighbors. People are neighbors here, which is cool. You don't get that. But at the same time, my only experience prior to coming to Minneapolis was participating in Line 3, getting denied service at Bagley, Minnesota, and also watching on a live stream some water protectors shout down and embarrass to the point he left the stage, Governor Walz, for his failure to even address like their questions to him. I think he was at, I don't know if he was at the governor's mansion or a donors event. It was outside. I just remember watching that and then reading the reports from my friend Aline Brown, who broke the story on how there was this escrow account that was created to pay the police officers overtime. This was something that was overseen by the state, but it was created, and Enbridge was actually paying money into that account, and they were literally being paid by Enbridge to police, the water protectors. And I just thought that was really fascinating because I come from a state that's like super right wing, and we defeated a pipeline in a super right wing state. We defeated a tar sands pipeline in a super right wing state. Like, put that in your head. Like, we are hated in our homelands. We don't have a vice governor who's native. We don't have land acknowledgements in South Dakota. We defeated a pipeline in a red state. And I came to Minnesota, and my first impression, because I'm naive, was that this was just a liberal state, and this wouldn't happen here. They wouldn't reroute the Keystone XL pipeline tar sands thing through Line 3. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't double the carbon footprint of the state with a single project. They wouldn't pay police taking money from the pipeline company. No, they did all of that. I saw it all like firsthand. And I'm sitting there thinking that it's like, what I still haven't come to the conclusion about what made it possible for the state to push through this pipeline. We defeated a pipeline in a red state. Like, just think about that. Like, you have to ask yourselves what happened. You have all these, people at all the high levels who are saying they had no power over it. This is like, well, then why did we the question I would ask then, what power do you have? You're literally at the top. What power do you actually have then? And that's not, the question that, that they want to answer. And the answer to that question isn't necessarily that they really care to change that. They're in the service of something else, right? At the end of the day. And I appreciate the politics of South Dakota because they're just honest about it. And here they just speak out two sides of their mouth, and it can be really confusing, and I'll be honest. I'm not trying to like call out the vice governor. I'm not trying to call out Native politicians. I'm just saying it can be a really confusing space to navigate when you want to talk about the governor of South Dakota, but you know what? We defeated that pipeline. We defeated that pipeline. And why did it get rerouted through Ojibwe territories in the north of Minnesota? Minnesota, nice. And I have not gotten an answer from anybody that I think is satisfying yet about why that happened, other than it was just a politics of convenience. And that's, at the end of the day, this is still an extractive state. That's the only conclusion I can draw from, not from the words, but from the actions and the lack of action of politicians. And I want to maybe end this conversation with a little bit more hopeful sort of analysis here. One of my friends, Dallas Goldtooth, who you might know, back in the day before he was famous, he was an organizer with IEN, and he, sent me some preliminary, research that he and others had done through Indigenous Environmental Network on the impact of the water protector movement on carbon emissions. And I had to like reread it multiple times, and I just couldn't wrap my head around these numbers because they did an analysis to not just understand the qualitative impact of like how the narrative shift, how do we got the Green New Deal, how we got, all these things, like people were recognizing Native people here and there, but the quantitative, like what was the actual impact of the water protector movement? And he looked at all these frontline struggles, Indigenous-led struggles in Canada and the United States, and they found that Indigenous-led movements at sites of extraction of fossil fuels, transportation, or refinement and production accounted for challenging a quarter of carbon emissions. 1/4, 25% of both Canada and the United States, two of the largest per capita polluters historically. Like, holy, I don't want to say a bad word, but man, that was like, I had to keep reading that over and over, because in Canada, Native people are like 5% of the population. In the United States, we're like maybe 1-ish. And we're leading movements that are challenging a quarter of carbon emissions. And it's not just, in this report that they put together, it's not just this saying what we oppose and what we're challenging, but it's also showing that like these communities, these movements are putting forward alternatives too. And we're in this moment in time where it's like, I think the politics that are on offer are so cynical, because we have people who are speaking out of two sides of their mouth, or they just want to kill us or deport us or put us in prison. Those are the two options we have, and it's not a very good place. I feel, I have a daughter, and I feel really like terrified, existential terror when I wake up sometimes about what the future is going to look like. But I fall back on this notion that like thinking about what Madonna Thunderhawk said and that what it means to be a water protector, because they want to just shove this into Indigenous issue. Oh, we're going to give the Native person a spot to speak. Give them 5 minutes, let them do the land acknowledgement, and then usher them off stage, and then we'll get to the real politics. But what's fascinating about the water protector movement, whether it was at Line 3 or in Standing Rock, was that it included non-Native people. And it wasn't this like weird hippy dippy thing where you find your spirit animal and become Native. It was just like, yeah, it was grounded in Indigenous principles, but it was like it was a universal concept and a universal identity that one could assume and take up. And the effects of that are measurable and quantifiable. That maybe in the future, when we think about me being at Line 3 or us being up there in northern Minnesota, breathing in that toxic air, seeing the devastating destruction of, clams and water and all these things, this very apocalyptic reality present, it's not a future, it's a present, that someday in the future that somebody will be breathing clean air or clean water, or drinking clean water, or having a job that they don't have to, that's not ruining their life or ruining the planet or ruining the people around them, that they might like look back and say, man, like I'm glad I have these ancestors that did something, and I think I finished this thing to talk about the cumulative effects of social movements. And I think I don't have any solutions other than to say this is what has happened, and this is what has been studied, and this is what has been quantified. This is how history has played out. It's not, inevitable. It's not predetermined. That we do have agency, and we do have alternatives beyond what is just presented to us. And I do think that water protectors are the ancestors, of the future.
So we are running short on time. I think there's so much that we could talk about. But I do have one last question, and we will end on a good note, I promise. So it's in your afterword, and it's when you're talking about your time here in Minneapolis. And you write about a specific night that the Red Roof Depot site was raided, and you talk about this picture of an unnamed missing Native woman, and I think we were actually talking when you saw that picture and you took it, and I remember like that night. I know there are lots of people in this room that were there. And when the tents went up at the Red Roof Depot site, like it was really incredible to see how fast it went up and how many people from the community came in and were just like, I mean, donating so much stuff, right? I think I brought like 20 pounds of firewood and then like went right to your class maybe or something like that. But I don't think anybody thought that the encampment was going to get raided that night. Like it felt like we had more time, right? And all of these things happen, and there's this moment where it's like, did we lose this? Mm-hmm. But we didn't, right? Because the Red Roof Depot is not going to be demolished, right? Like yes. So like really, really incredible community groups on the south side and in East Phillips, Camp Ninkasi and AIM and EPNI and the Climate Justice Committee and the Indigenous Protectors Movement, like so many people, right, that showed up, and also just lots of people from the south side showing up. And on top of that, Smith Foundry was just announced to be shut down, which is right across the street. And this is the protection of the land. So what I really want to ask you about this is, what can we learn? What can we take away from this moment on the south side of Minneapolis? Ensuring that we're protecting our children, our youth, our future generation, and the ancestors of the future that were in that moment, ensuring that the community was protected.
I'll tell the story. Actually, it pertains to Vinny and Crow and Jolene and Lori. Was that her name? From Little? Yeah, Lori Ellison. And we just should publish this podcast. I was working this last October with Little Earth Youth organization, and they were creating a podcast and I was supporting them with Red Media. They did this interview of former Little Earth residents, and one of the stories that was told, I think Lori told this story about how in the 1970s, kids were getting hit on Cedar Avenue, that used to be a highway and then became a city street. It goes through Little Earth United Tribes, and every week, AIM and the Little Earth residents would take the big drum and sit in the middle of the street and shut down traffic because they just asked the city to put up a stoplight or like a crosswalk light. And this happened for several weeks, and they would, the city would send in MPD, the riot squad, beat people up and arrest them, and then haul them off to jail, and then they'd come out again the next week and do the same thing. And finally, I think it was Lord, or somebody was saying, asking the police officer, and I actually found the article in the Star Tribune. They asked the police officer, like, how many, like, you guys are like coming out here like all the time with the riot squad and beating people up and arresting them. Like, how much does that cost you to come down here every time? And they're like, oh, about $20,000. And you're like, well, how much did the proposed stoplight cost? $10,000. But it shows you like that small thing that we see. And I always think about that, like when I drive by and we see there's the overhead walkway and everything. And I think about that just to protect children playing. That's what people had to do in this city. That's what like Native people had to do in this city. And it's like, I don't have I could give countless examples, but it shows you how community protects itself in these ways and organizes. And it was just like one of those stories, like, yeah, we know about Wounded Knee, we know about, the BIA takeover, all these things. And this story was just like, these weren't all the bigwigs of AIM. It was just like Little Earth residents who were coming out and just doing this over and over again, just for a stoplight, for the crosswalk. And I was just really like, I was moved by that, because we think of resistance as this kind of spectacular thing with confrontation of police. And it is a lot of time, but also it's like about these small things that we sometimes take for granted, like the safety of our children, access to, like foods and things like that. And, another example is like, I went to this community baby shower where they're giving out food and diapers, like here at Little Earth. And it was awesome. And it was open to anyone, but it was awesome because it's like, it shows like the values of Native people are still present to this day. And it's not just like, again, it's not like, oh, Native people are some kind of special whatever. These are values that everyone should benefit from, and those alternatives arise not always in spectacular moments of confrontation with police, but in Standing Rock, for example, or at the Roof Depot thing. It was just like being in community. I got to learn more about Minneapolis. I got to make some really beautiful friends. I learned about the movements here in Minneapolis, the ones that actually show up. I learned about the neighborhood, but I wouldn't have gotten that had it not been for that struggle, And I think, I'm just one person, but it's like, imagine what the effect that has on other people. And I'll say this in kind of closing, is that I remember at Standing Rock, some of my relatives from back home, they like to party a little too much. They have problems, people have problems. Everyone has problems. But what was fascinating is seeing those relatives in that moment in time, lined out, like being who they always were meant to be and supposed to be, being healthy individuals. Sure, there was like 92 different law enforcement jurisdictions surrounding us. Sure, like there was 800 arrests, but people were like experiencing freedom in that moment. And it was like those small moments that I think we kind of like gloss over a little bit, just for the kind of like the headline of, police raided the 1851 treaty camp, or, police did this and this and this. And I think Roof Depot is a good example of that. It's showing that these are long-term investments. The struggle for even having, Native housing in the city, that didn't happen because somebody was just like, thought of, somebody was crying long enough on the shoulder of the man who stole their land. And finally he was just like, you know what, guys, just have it. It didn't happen that way. It happened through struggle, and people were forward thinking. What's that?
Mayday Books put this on. We've got, I assume we probably have copies left in the back of Nick's book, Our History is the Future, out on Haymarket. We've also got some copies of The Red Deal, which the Red Nation put out. And 100% of sales are going to go to donation to Red Media, which funds Nick's the Red Nation podcast, and their book program, and all these other great things. So if you haven't yet, please pick one up. So thank you all for coming out.